This is Walter Bosley, and I'm going to share with you a selection from Ambrose Bierce, F.A. Mitchell-Hedges, and the Crystal Skull by Sibley, S. Morrill. Reading from the foreword. It is the thesis of this book that the mysterious disappearance in Mexico in 1913 of Major Ambrose Bierce, one of the most important and controversial figures in American literature, was vitally involved with the appearance in the 20th century of the extraordinary crystal skull in some way acquired by the late F.A. Mitchell-Hedges, known primarily as a British explorer of Central America during the 20s and 30s, and that both men went into Mexico at the same time with General Pancho Villa's army, furthermore, as secret agents of their governments. While the evidence offered does not prove the ultimate fate of Bierce, it does present a more rational explanation than has yet been given of Bierce's actions in the months prior to his going to Mexico, and the reasons for his going there. It is also an indication that he almost certainly reached British Honduras by the summer or fall of 1914, finally disappearing in that general area and possibly in a section from which other and mysterious disappearances have occurred during this century, 3 of them being given. The nature of the evidence includes documentary material, most of which has been available for years, but which, so far as we can determine, has never before been assembled for publication, a matter which in itself forms something of a mystery, and for which the explanation suggested will not be popular in certain official circles. The first 3 chapters deal with the skull itself. They show its authenticity as one of the greatest jewels in the world, its importance in the Mayan head variant system of numeration, and its significance to the religion of the Maya as a sacred object. Though Bierce is not mentioned in those chapters, their reading is essential to an understanding of why it was that certain persons have suppressed knowledge of the skull, including a glaring example from 2 major publishing houses, one British and the other American, in the publishing of Mitchell-Hedges' autobiography. Their reading also serves to underline the need for Mitchell-Hedges' consistent refusal to say how, when, or where he acquired the skull, and his negative testimony on his relationship to Bierce. The evidence that Bierce and Mitchell-Hedges were secret agents in Mexico for intelligence purposes is given in chapters 4 through 7. It is our belief that the hypothesis to that effect forms the only sensible explanation for a chain of phenomena that is otherwise not explicable, even by using the spavined workhorse of coincidence. Chapter 1. In July 1936, Man, a monthly record of anthropological science published under the direction of the Royal Anthropological Institute of Great Britain and Ireland, devoted 5 pages to a comparison study of 2 life-size crystal skulls, which manifestly are among the most remarkable jewels in the world, as well as the only 2 such known to be in existence, so to speak. One was described as the Burney skull, through its having been lent by Sidney Burney, a London art dealer with whom the owner, the late F.A. Mitchell-Hedges, had left it as a security for a loan. The other was the so-called Aztec skull, which the British Museum reportedly had acquired in 1898 from a French officer who had served under Maximilian in Mexico. What prompted the editors of Man to devote so much space to the study was that up to a short time before, the British Museum skull had been the only one known of such size and excellence of workmanship. But now there was another, not only of almost identical size and shape, but much more beautifully fashioned. Furthermore, since the origin of the second was far more obscure than that of the first, except for the seeming certainty that it also came from Mexico, in whose culture the skull has long been a dominant symbol, and since each of them represented fantastic amount of work on the part of the ancient artist who made them, the editors were naturally interested in learning what an intensive, expert study of the two skulls would reveal. The participating scholars were among the best in the field. They were Dr. G.M. Morant, one of the most eminent anthropologists, Adrian Digby, who became keeper of the British Museum's Department of Ethnology, and H.J. Brownholtz, a member of the British Museum staff. Inevitably, one of the first things to engage the attention of the trio was the matter of whether either of the skulls could be of modern workmanship. Their findings on that score were negative. As Digby wrote, "In neither case is there any trace of identifiable tool marks, and it is certain that neither specimen was made with steel tools. On the teeth there is no trace of a lapidary's wheel, which would betray one or both specimens as being of comparatively recent origin." End quote. With the question of a modern forgery out of the way, the matter that then drew the attention of the scholars was how to account for the similarities and the differences. Morant noting that the absence of suture marks on the skulls meant that few of the usual measurements can be taken at all accurately, end quote, nonetheless found that the two skulls were so alike that it became impossible to avoid the conclusion that they are not of independent origin. It is almost inconceivable that the two artificers, having no connection with one another and using different human skulls as models, should have produced specimens so closely similar in form as these two are. End quote. As for the fact that the lower jaw in the Mitchell-Hedges Burney skull was detachable while that of the other was not, and that its teeth and eye sockets were more natural in shaping than those of the British Museum skull, those points meant merely that greater realism had been given to the one than to the other. In his opinion, it was safe to conclude that they are representations of the same human skull, though one may have been copied from the other. End quote. Also, he observed, there were certain points which suggested that the original was quite possibly the skull of a female, and maybe a European, although the question of what race remained one which cannot be answered decisively. End quote. The findings of Morant did not agree with those of Digby. While admitting that Dr. Morant's comparison is very impressive, Digby felt it probable from the stylistic differences that the two skulls are not contemporary with one another. Also, he maintained that if the two were made after the same original, the original would have had to be a particularly important skull, probably belonging to a culture hero or warrior, a difficult concept in view of the findings of feminine characteristics in both skulls, and one which would involve pure coincidence. Hence, he concluded, in spite of the remarkable similarity of outline in which Dr. Morant has demonstrated, it still appears unwise to assume that the two skulls are based on the same original. H.A. Brownholtz was of approximately the same opinion as Digby. He felt that the British Museum skull had peculiarities of stylization that are in accordance with the general character of ancient Mexican art. The Mitchell-Hedges skull, on the other hand, showed so much attention to the correct rendering of detail that such realism seems beyond the ordinary range of Aztec art, and gives the skull the character of almost an anatomical study in a scientific age. Taken as a whole, the study is an impressive one. Indeed, it is safe to say that the two skulls could not have been given a more searching examination in more respects than the participants gave it. Its net results are that both skulls are not of modern workmanship, inasmuch as no traces of it can be found on either. That the skulls have remarkable similarities in shape, that they have sufficient female characteristics to suggest the original on which they were modified was a female skull that may have been the direct model for both, but that one may have been copied from the other, and that the Mitchell-Hedges skull is more nearly anatomically perfect than the British Museum skull. But the study is also impressive for some points it did not emphasize. One is that while both skulls represent a high degree of workmanship and anatomical knowledge, although much the more so in the case of the Mitchell-Hedges skull, neither has a feature which each should have and could easily have had if the artists had been seeking merely to fashion replicas of the skull of some famous person, whether male or female. The missing feature is the suture marks on the pates. To have them put on would have been no trick at all for the artist, and since suture marks on any skull are one of the most impressive things about it, it seems strange that the reason for their absence should not have been questioned in the study. As to what that reason had to be, a separate chapter is needed to discuss it. On another point, which the scientists noted along with the absence of suture marks but did not question, is that the lower jaw on the Mitchell-Hedges skull is detachable, whereas that on the British Museum skull is not. To ascribe the reason for this difference merely to the whim of the artist, to his desire to be more realistic in the one case as against the other, is not enough. For if that were the reason, then it would have to be one of the most costly any artist ever had for providing his work with a mere refinement. Why that is true is that the marking of the lower jaw, so it is easily detachable, called for hundreds, if not thousands, of hours of extra work, and of the most demanding kind. In fact, it is probable that no other task in the history of jewelry, including the cleaving of a great diamond, involved more careful thinking and greater skill, to say nothing of what it meant to the future of the artist in life expectancy. For in the cutting and the shaping of the crystal in its natural state, and in making the lower jaw detachable, the artist was confronted with an extra demand that made his otherwise difficult task abnormally more so. He had to so work the stone that two natural prisms in the back of the skull's mouth would channel light upwards into the eye sockets. The shaping of the crystal to fulfill that purpose called for not only a remarkable knowledge of optics, but for an extraordinary degree of precision and workmanship. Also, since crystal is easily shattered, no such task as making the lower jaw detachable and providing for the most effective use of the prisms would ever have been undertaken merely to give greater realism to the skull. On the contrary, the only reason that could justify countless hours of work this added refinement necessitated would have had to be one of the greatest significance, one far beyond just the desire for artistic perfection. What that reason was, though it, like the prisms themselves, evidently escaped the notice of the British scholars, there can be no doubt. It was a matter involving the central points of both the mathematics and the religion of the Maya, a people from whose culture the Aztec and other ancient Mexican nations were to draw heavily. Chapter 2. Probably no other people present more in... Let me start that line over again. Probably no other people present more and greater mysteries than do the Maya, whose descendants, today numbering over 2 million, are found mainly in Yucatan and the area around the Bay of Honduras. One of the things to make them so mysterious is not that they built over 100 great cities whose ruins have been found in the jungles from southern Mexico to Honduras, but rather that having built them, they suddenly chose, around 1000 AD, to abandon them. Why they elected to do such a thing is a matter still not decided to general satisfaction. Some of the cities they quitted had been inhabited for so long as 10 centuries or more. Others were comparatively new. In any case, and whatever the reason, they were all deserted at about the same time, as if the inhabitants had been moved by an impulse similar to that which periodically sends hordes of lemmings marching from their homelands on a seeming migration to the sea. There are, of course, other examples of cities being abandoned by their inhabitants for unknown reasons. The desertion of the great city of Angkor in Cambodia is a case in point. But its people, whoever they were, did not quit a great array of cities such as the Maya left, nor did the Maya vanish from history as the ancient Cambodians apparently did. On the contrary, they moved elsewhere, mainly into areas of Yucatan, where they built other cities and continued to evidence yet other mysteries, a characteristic, by the way, that they still seem to have. But the mystery involved in the desertion of the Mayan cities, fascinating as it is relatively minor when compared to another posted by this extraordinary people, namely their amazing development of a mathematics that was not only fully as good as that of the Europeans at the time of the conquest, but probably superior to the mathematics of the Europeans, Asians, or Africans in classic times. According to the late Professor Sylvanus G. Morrill in his The Ancient Maya, from Stanford University Press in 1946, sometime during the 4th or 3rd centuries before Christ, the Maya priests, for the first time in the history of the human race, devised a system of numeration by position, involving the conception and use of the mathematical quantity of 0, a tremendous abstract intellectual accomplishment, end quote. This product of Mayan philosophic thought, for that is what it had to be, barring the very real possibility of their having got it from a presently unknown civilization, took place around 1,000 years before the Hindus, usually credited with originating the 0 concept, are supposed to have invented it. And strangely enough, this amazing Mayan discovery is inextricably involved with the history of the Mitchell-Hedges and the British Museum crystal skulls. To appreciate this involvement, it is essential to have a clear picture of the Mayan system of numeration. It was vigesimal rather than decimal, going by 20s rather than 10s, a matter that suggests the Maya apparently felt early in their history that they needed to count on their toes as well as their fingers, in contrast to other peoples who counted on their fingers alone. Just as we have 2 sets of symbols for writing numbers, the Roman and the Arabic, the Maya had 2. One is the bar and dot system, employing an elliptically shaped shell for 0. The other is the head variant system, consisting of 14 symbols, each represented by a different head, for the numbers 0 to 13 inclusive. Of these 2 methods of notation, Morley says the head variant was closer to that of our Arabic numerals. But, since the Mayan system was vigesimal, how did the Maya, using the head variants, form the higher numbers from 14 to 19 inclusive? They did it by transferring the value of 10 to the appropriate lower number to form the desired higher one. The instrument used was the fleshless lower jaw of the head glyph for 10, which happened to be unique among the 14 head variant symbols in being a fleshless human skull, the emblem of the death god Apuch. As Morley described it, the head variant for 10 is the death's head or skull, and in forming the head variants for the numbers 14 to 19 inclusive, the fleshless lower jaw of the death's head was the part used to represent the value of 10 in those composite heads for the 6 highest numbers. Thus, if the fleshless lower jaw is applied to the lower part of the head for 6, the resulting head will be that for 16, that is, 10 plus 16. At this point, it is well to note that Morley must have been aware of the comparison study in man, but he made no mention in his The Ancient Maya of the Mitchell-Hedges skull with its detachable lower jaw. The omission is a strange one in view of the battery of experts authenticating it. Nonetheless, a logical reason for it will be shown later. Curiously enough, though Morley was as well informed on the Maya as any other scholar, and though he saw that the head variants employed were quite possibly those of the 13 gods of the upper world in the Mayan pantheon, it did not apparently occur to him to wonder why the skull with detachable lower jaw should have been chosen as the crucially important symbol for the figure 10. Possibly he thought it unimportant, or not of sufficient importance to warrant immediate inquiry. In any event, the choice of the death's head with the detachable lower jaw for the pivotal figure 10 could not have been accidental. On the contrary, it had to be deliberate. That would be the case whether or not the Maya had the crystal skull at the time. But if they did have the crystal skull when they got their mathematics, it would have been most natural for them to have thought of using the detachable lower jaw as the means for transferring the value of 10 to create higher numbers. What would more readily suggest such a thought than possession of such an object, which would then serve as the archetype for 10? On the other hand, if they did not have the crystal skull at the time they got their mathematical concepts, they still might have thought of using the detachable lower jaw for that purpose, but the thought would have been a most improbable one, since they would have lacked the object to suggest it to them. That the decision to so use the lower jaw of the death's head was deliberate in either case is quite evident, for if the Mayan priesthood had the ingenuity and philosophic skill to employ the remarkable mathematical concepts, they had to have the insight to perceive how such a symbol as the death's head, with its detachable lower jaw, could be put to use for the benefit of their people and their ecclesiastical organization. Indeed, they would have had to use it so, if they had already possessed the skull, since it is an inherent characteristic of priesthoods everywhere to make the maximum use of symbolism, both to teach the truths they advocate and to perpetuate their own power. What the symbolism was in the choice of the death's head for the figure 10 is not an esoteric matter. The figure 10 stands precisely at the midpoint in the 21 numbers ranging from 0 to 20 inclusive. The use of the fleshless lower jaw to transfer the value of 10 to a lower number in the series in order to convert it to a higher number in the second half is about as dramatic a lesson as one could ask for. It says as plainly as can be that if a person makes the proper use of life, and death itself as the culmination of life, if, in other words, he follows the teachings of the priesthood as instructed, he is assured of making the higher number, of attaining paradise. The lesson has all the ring of elemental truth, of an importance that cannot be surpassed. It indicates an idealism of high degree. It puts the matter of advancement squarely up to the individual, where it ought to be, a matter that would have great appeal to the priests. Furthermore, the fact that use of these head variant symbols was spread throughout the country of the Maya, being displayed on the stelae and other monuments they erected so abundantly that no one could miss them, indicates that the lesson was meant to have the maximum significance to the symbol-conscious people. As to the effect of the lesson, there can be little doubt. The Maya did, as much as any people, and more so than many, strictly adhere to the precepts of their religious leaders. And under the leadership of their mathematically minded priesthood, they built one of the most remarkable civilizations of which there is record. In addition to temples, palaces, observatories, and other public buildings, they constructed a highway system that is one of the most extraordinary known. Their highways, the longest, runs for 62.3 miles from Coba to Yucatan, straight as a die for the most part, were elevated above the surrounding terrain at a height of from 2 to 8 feet. The sides were of roughly dressed stone, and their surfaces, usually of about 15 feet in width, were covered with a cement that makes them today, after the passage of as much as 10 centuries for some sections, fully as effective as they ever were. In fact, the Maya were such excellent road builders that the Romans were inferior, according to Dr. Thomas Gann, a noted archaeologist who, while en route one day to Coba, from which radiate 16 Mayan highways, discovered another that was 32 feet wide. But while these Mayan achievements and others that could be mentioned may justly be attributed in good part to the use of the skull symbol as the figure 10, just as many achievements of the Europeans may be attributed to the effect the crucifix has had upon them, one should not assume that the crystal skull did not have yet another tremendously important use. Indeed, its other uses were every bit as important as those in its capacity as the archetype of the symbol for 10. In fact, there is reason to feel, as will be shown that the effect of its other uses was so profound that it may have been actually devastating to the Maya, so devastating that in these other uses may lie the cause of the wholesale abandonment of the Maya cities at about the end of the first millennium of the Christian era, as well as the onset of the period of civil war and foreign aggression that disrupted the so-called New Empire of the Maya, finally brought to ruin by the Europeans. What these other uses consisted of was the employment of the crystal skull for the purposes of oracular utterances, foreseeing the future and affecting future events. Three tasks that traditionally have always been, and so they are today, those of any priesthood, regardless of the means employed to carry them out. That the Maya so used the crystal skull does not depend on the wholly reasonable assumption that any priesthood possessing such an object would inevitably employ it for those purposes. While such an act would be instinctive, there are other and more tangible evidences. One of the more obvious lies in the evidence in the skull itself of how the Maya used it for uttering oracles. As noted earlier, a most significant feature of the skull, one that must have been taken into consideration when the skull was shaped from its original piece of crystal, is the presence of the two prisms within it, a discovery by Frank Dorland, one of the country's most gifted art conservators, and who has studied the skull for years. To the artist, in forming the skull, shape the crystal so as to take full advantage of these prisms is made evident by how perfectly the skull is suited to the business of uttering oracles. Since the business of oracular utterances has always been one of the most important means available to any priesthood for strengthening its ecclesiastical organization, it has always been attended by a certain amount of staging, carefully calculated to convince the person seeking the oracle that he is getting his money's worth. In the case of the crystal skull, the most effective way in which that purpose could be served would be to have the skull in some darkened fane, placed on an altar before which the oracle seeker would be introduced. If that were done, and after appropriate rites and ceremonies had been observed, the seeker were to see the skull suddenly illuminated, and if he were at the same time to hear the skull speak and see it move, the probabilities would be completely in favor of his being convinced that he had got what he sought. The means by which this bit of stagecraft could be effected is simplicity itself. For the illumination of the skull, all that is required is its being properly placed on an altar over a small hole through which, at the appropriate moment, light from a flame beneath the altar is admitted. The light, thanks to its passage through the prisms, is channeled into the eye sockets and other facial areas of the skull to give the desired effect. How the skull would be moved in order to give the illusion of speaking is a matter that would be handled by two holes in its base. A rod thrust up through another hole in the altar and into the larger hole in the base of the skull would provide the means whereby motion could be given to the crystal. The smaller hole in the skull's base would serve as the receiver for a pivot point on which the skull would move. Matters demonstrated by Dorland in his experiments. Thus it is quite evident that if a person saw the skull's face illuminated, saw the skull move, and heard a voice speaking, a matter easily handled by the means of a tube, he would be strongly inclined to believe what he was told. For few men, even today under such circumstances, would be prone to consider how such simple devices would be used. But evident as it is from the skull itself how it was used for oracular utterances, there are yet other characteristics of the skull to make equally plain how it was used for foreseeing the future, so to speak. The most obvious evidence lies in the fact which, though noted by the participants in the comparison study reported in Man, apparently did not stir their curiosity: the absence of the suture marks on the pate. Since, as has already been pointed out, The suture marks would not only have been among the easiest things to form, but would also have been giving greater realism to the skull, and, in point of fact, would have been delineated if the skull was to have served merely as a memorial. It is mandatory to ask why they were left out. In short, just what purpose could there be? What justification for such an omission? Manifestly, the only reason why the artist did not put them on was that he was forbidden to do so, that he knew that such an easily carved feature would be completely unacceptable. Why that would be so is that to have the suture marks there would interfere with the prime functions of the skull, those of foreseeing the future and affecting the outcome of events. In brief, suture marks on the pate would be as out of place as engravings on the surface of a crystal ball to be used by a crystal gazer. The foreseeing of the future would be handled by basically the same technique as that used by some crystal gazers today. The priest, after preliminaries that might include fasting, the use of drugs, or both, and after other prescribed rites, would peer down into the crystal in an effort to see in its depths and striations the picture which he sought of what the future held. How effective an aid the crystal skull was in foretelling the future is unknowable. All that can be said with certainty on that point is that it was probably the most effective crystal ball ever devised, and since there are cases of precognition on record, of an induced as well as an accidental kind, it is highly probable that in some cases over the centuries the skull served that purpose well. In fact, when one considers what may be evidence of its use for affecting the outcome of events, of controlling and shaping the future, it is likely that it had a fairly good incidence of success. As a preliminary to how the crystal skull was so used, it should be noted that there is a strong body of literature on the subject of psychokinetic energy moving visible objects. Naturally, if psychokinetic energy can move visible objects, it can move invisible ones as well. If that is admitted, then it should be possible that psychokinetic energy can move molecules, and in such a way that patterns can be formed. In rock crystal, there is a marked elasticity and cohesion in the crystalline substance, as there has to be, to one degree or another, in just about everything. If then psychokinetic energy were applied to an area of rock crystal with sufficient intensity, it should be theoretically possible for it to alter the molecular structure in such a way as to form a marked preconceived pattern. If the psychokinetic energy were applied often enough in a given area, the elasticity should finally weaken sufficiently so that at some point the limit would be passed and the pattern remain set in the crystal, thus becoming permanently visible to the naked eye. At any rate, that possibility is worth exploring in view of certain fascinating things about the crystal skull and the way in which the Maya priests probably used it to affect events. That they did use the skull for that purpose is scarcely questionable. People today, as throughout history, feel that to one degree or another, wishing makes it so. When it doesn't, the disappointed ones seem to feel that the trouble was they didn't wish hard enough, didn't sufficiently focus the power of their wish on the objective. In the case of the crystal skull, the obvious technique for this purpose would be for the priest to peer down into the skull from behind and above in the attempt to channel his psychic powers, those of whatever god he invoked, probably Apuk, the death god, since any look into the future is past the deaths of whoever or whatever dies in the span of the future covered, and the psychic power of the crystal skull itself toward whatever object or person he wished to influence. Since the skull would have been personalized in the belief of the user, he would probably turn it to face in the direction of the objective. And since the majority of people are right-handed, thus tending to use the right foot and right eye somewhat more than the left, it is likely that most priests tended to focus the various powers through the right eye socket of the skull. If that were the case, and if the theory is correct that psychokinetic energy can alter the molecules of the crystal in such a way as to make them form definite patterns, one of which may become set, then the logical place for the corroborating evidence would be in the right eye socket of the skull. Whether that is the explanation for the phenomena found in the right eye socket, or whether they are due to sheer coincidence, it is a fact that from certain angles, some extraordinary forms appear there in the right eye socket, so distinct that they can be photographed. One is that of a truncated pyramid, which looks exactly like so many of the truncated pyramids the Maya erected in their cities and centers of worship. Another form, seen when the right eye socket is viewed from a slightly different angle, looks like a state capitol building. At first thought, it seems absurd to attribute such an architectural form to the Maya. State capitol buildings were certainly unknown to them, regardless of how far into the future they may occasionally have looked. As it so happens, however, the Maya did erect a structure very like it in shape. The building is known today as the Caracol, an astronomical observatory at Chichen Itza. Enough of its round tower is still standing so that one can plainly see the entire structure. Originally had a general appearance and outline very like that of one of our state capitol buildings. But the construction of truncated pyramids and astronomical observatories would not have been the only events the outcome of which the Mayan priests would choose to effect by using the powers of the skull. Inevitably, there would have been others, and of these, one of the most important would have been that calling for the elimination of certain powerful enemies. Hence, there ought to be evidence of that use, too, in the right eye socket. And there is, or at least there is what may be reasonably interpreted as such. It consists of little skull shapes, which are also photographable, and which presumably represent the condition the Mayan priest wished the heads of certain enemies to permanently assume. It is perfectly true, of course, we repeat, that all these images in the right eye socket of the skull may be due to nothing but coincidence. But if so, it is decidedly on the remarkable side, especially since, look as one will in the left eye socket and in other areas of the skull, one does not find anything resembling such a collection of shapes with so marked a relationship to the Mayan culture. They just aren't there. In view of that, a positive statement that coincidence is the cause of these phenomena would be a statement every bit as silly as would be the negative statement that they were not due to the use of psychokinetic energy in the manner attributed to the Mayan priests above. That the Mayan priests did so use the skull, there can be no reasonable doubt. That there should be a collection of phenomena in the right eye socket is certainly remarkable. So much so that the likelihood they are due to coincidence is probably less than the likelihood they are due to the use of certain psychic forces about which modern man is only beginning to learn. In any case, that the Maya used the skull as the archetype of the figure 10, and that it was deeply involved with the intellectual growth of the Maya and the growth of their religion and civilization, are matters that seem evident. So much so that the question immediately arises as to whether the skull was equally involved with their decline.